Do people think that they're in the right place? This is, hello folks, my name is Asia Mason, and I'm the Executive Director of the Yukon Status of Women Council, which is a small not-for-profit that's been operating for the last 50 years in the Yukon Territory. Our mandate is very backline in nature, which means that we promote gender justice using the tools of policy analysis, community-based research, as well as education. Like that? I might be. Oh, okay. Like this. Okay, so folks, this was kind of a beautiful segue a little bit from the previous speaker talking about data gaps, specifically in rural, remote, and northern spaces. For us, we have a mandate, as I mentioned, that's focusing a lot on gender justice. Just noticing a lot of feedback. Can people hear me okay? It's like buzzing a little bit. So I'm going to hone in on a really specific example here, and I'm going to ask you folks to pay attention to this slide that describes the nature of data gaps as it relates to any social issue. In this particular case, we're talking about sexualized violence or gender-based violence. We know that gender-based violence is profoundly underreported. And so if you can imagine that each one of those dots is an occurrence of some kind of gender-based violence, whether that's sexualized violence or harassment, and the list goes on and on and on, or intimate partner violence, we know that the vast majority are unreported, which is reflected by the yellow dots. The teal and the blue dots represent occurrences of gender-based violence that may end up as data, or it may not, depending on how many constraints are imposed on that data. So if you look at the funnel, we're talking here specifically about all of the kinds of data constraints that exist in places that are rural, remote, and northern. So for example, there are legal constraints as reflected in things like legislation and regulations, as also mentioned on this list, things like the Privacy Act or the Access to Health Information Act and ATIP and other things that exist on federal levels. We can't have access to RCMP data because that's regulated under the RCMP Act and the Privacy Act. There are institutional and ethical considerations, so often research ethics boards will impose suppression rules on how much data is or is not available. It might be acquired, but the data itself is not accessible. So taken together, amidst all the variable kinds of constraints that are imposed on data, we're left with situations where gender-based violence response systems are built from really low quality data. And this is the case again for many rural, remote, and northern spaces. Sure. Thanks. I'm just going to drive this home with a very relevant recent point. So the Yukon Status Women Council, we conducted 2 massive projects over the last 18 months, one of which involved interviewing over 50 folks who are women identified, Yukoners, and the other involved actual surveys that we distributed, and we had about 150 responses. We then analyzed those data, compared it to the data that we were able to obtain from the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, the Yukon Bureau of Statistics, and Statistics Canada. Lo and behold, the data we obtained from those secondary sources, i.e. the primary sources that are often informing policy decisions, we could not disaggregate any of those data, meaning we were not able to access data from StatsCan, YBS, or Canadian Index of Wellbeing that had both gender and ethnicity, or in this case, indigeneity. Not surprisingly, again, what we found was that, of course, because we were able to disaggregate the data that we had access to, these massive chasms that existed in the experiences of Caucasian Yukon women versus Indigenous Yukon women. And the point here is that, notice, these differences were not reflected in any of these 3 data sources. The takeaway: the experiences of Indigenous women are being invisibilized if we're relying on these data sources. I'm just going to try and go to the next slide. I'm going to use some really recent examples. Sorry, I'm like so awkward with microphones. I don't know how to talk into them. I just want to like stand back here and just like project. Sorry, thanks. Like a little Yukon bush girl. Okay, so this is from about a year ago, but I'll just frame this in the context for folks who are not necessarily from the Yukon, we just finished an inquest into the deaths of 4 Indigenous women who died at the Whitehorse Emergency Shelter. And you'll notice that in the coroner's reports that are published, we are not able to obtain disaggregated data from the coroner's reports, meaning we are not able to tell the number of First Nations women who died as a result of opioid overdose deaths. The Yard Aboriginal Women's Society, the organization in the Yukon Territory that holds the repository on MMIWG data, were denied standing. They were denied standing at the coroner's inquest because there was no substantive evidence that it was an Indigenous women's issue. So like, talk about systemic gaslighting. Everybody and their dog knows it's Indigenous women who are dying, and some presiding coroner from down south tells us that they don't have a claim that's substantive enough to have standing. Okay, now let's switch gears for a sec here. This is data from Stats Canada that was provided by the RCMP. Notice this is in Watson Lake, the most southern community in the Yukon Territory. We're looking here at the number of actual charges laid as a function of the year with respect to the level of sexualized violence. We see that in the only column that has numbers in it, we don't know anything about who was charged. We don't know anything about their gender, about their indigeneity. Just stay with me here, it's leading up to something. This is a decision document from the Kudzakaya project, which is slated to be, and is currently being built as we speak, the largest mining operation in the Yukon Territory. In the decision document that was issued for Kudzakaya, notice that it states, this was a recommendation that was accepted, without going into the legalities of where YESEB fits into this, this recommendation becomes a term and condition for the proponent, for BMC Minerals. This supposed term and condition is going to measure pre-project baseline data on the number or occurrences of violence with special consideration for Indigenous women close to the project. The question that I have is, how are they going to do that? With what data? With what data? We saw in the last slide, this is literally the most granular data that we can find when it comes to sexualized violence at the level of Watson Lake, one of the 2 communities closest to the project. So what are we left with when we have these massive data chasms, these data gaps? We know that it reveals a misrepresentation of reality. We're no longer calibrating the policies or decisions that we are making to what's actually happening on the ground for folks, and not to mention resource misallocation. And this is really important, especially in 2024 when we're in hyperpolarized, diminished trust and confidence in public institutions, only compels and further promotes a lack of trust and compliance. We need a paradigm shift in rural, remote, and northern spaces. And this is what we're proposing with this current SSHRC-funded project. Essentially, I know I only have 5 minutes left. We want to essentially see a paradigm shift where human individuals are no longer the unit of measurement. That is to say, there are too many barriers, as we've just seen in the few examples I've provided. There are too many barriers to either acquiring disaggregated data or providing or sharing disaggregated data. And those kinds of constraints are only going to get more robust as we see Yukon First Nations developing their own data governance and data sovereignty initiatives, right? This siloing is only going to get more extreme. By shifting from people as the unit of measurement to communities as the unit of measurement, we're able to more reliably measure the impacts of different kinds of policy decisions or infrastructure development. So I'm gonna sort of pick on Faro a little bit. It's supposed to be a made-up community. What we're proposing is the development of a resilience framework that uses the only indicators that we're able to reliably, sustainably obtain without having to breach privacy. So that's like, we get access to the level of turnover at detachments of our CMP. We know how much affordable housing exists in each given community. We know whether or not there's a women's shelter, for example. There are infrastructure components, whether physical, tangible, or policy-wise, that can easily be measured and tell us through a sort of proxy indicator model how well or how resilient a community is. And then we're not faced with the same kind of data gaps that we've been chronically faced with for the last 10 years, if not longer, in rural, remote, northern spaces. So again, I'm just going to pound through this because there's 2 minutes left. Sorry, it's my tech inadequacies. We want to really promote a sense of inquiry as we think about how do governments and legislation define evidence, especially evidence in relationship to evidence-informed decision-making. What does that look like in spaces like the Yukon territory, for example? If we don't have a robust definition of evidence and how it is that evidence is tethered to decision-making, we're left with pretty lousy indicators and pretty crappy signal-to-noise ratios, if you will. Mixed methods have to be implemented, right? Once big N is big enough and that big N is smaller than little n equation that we're so familiar with in the Yukon, right? That the population size is often too small to develop or utilize methodologies that require significance in sample sizing, right? Quantitative kinds of methodologies. Until we move away from or get larger population sizes, we do have to use mixed methods. CBR, community-based research, again, this is nothing new. This is like oral tradition. This is First Nations talking about like how we communicate our stories. And now this is just a fancy science word of saying that. But community-based research and community-based narratives need to be upregulated and concretized or reified, made real in these legislative definitions of evidence and how those tether to policy decisions. Lastly, capacity building, literacy about data gaps. I think there's a lack of literacy about data and the data gaps that do exist in these spaces. And finally, proxy indicators, like I mentioned before, right? We can use creative ways of, when we can't directly measure a phenomenon, we can use indirect measures. This is like, think about the insurance business, right? They're calculating probabilities based on indirect indicators all the time and making bank. Why aren't we implementing that at a governance level? And the last thing is just like reflecting here. Data is not neutral, we know that. These data gaps have implications, profound implications, as we just saw with the inquest and the denial of Liard Aboriginal Women's Society for having standing at the inquest, right? We also see a horrible quote. Well, it's not even that horrible, but I think he was a male, pale, stale dude, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, right? There is nothing that a government hates more than to be well-informed, for it makes the process of arriving at decisions much more complicated and difficult. I'm just gonna leave it here because I think I'm way over time.
We can just leave a couple minutes for questions if you want.